Versatility by design. OM-1 and OM-1Mkii at the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve at Laudholm Farms. Flowers fight, peeps, flight, ferns, and songsters. The OM Systems OM-1 and OM-1Mkii really are among the few cameras that seem to have been purpose-designed for nature photography. Coupled with an excellent selection of lenses from macro and wide-angle zooms to long telezooms, their subject detection, eye-tracking autofocus, fast and flexible frame rates, and array of useful computational features make them ideal cameras for a day in the great outdoors when almost anything might happen. My go-to outfit is the OM-1 II, an M.Zuiko 100-400 IS zoom on my cotton carrier, and my original OM-1 fitted with the 12-45 f4 Pro zoom on a strap and the Ulanzi quick release plate at my hip. Recently, I parked at the main parking area for the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve at Laudholm Farms and walked the mile out to Laudholm Beach, where the piping plovers and the least terns nest. Partially because I had this video in mind, I stopped once through the old farm buildings, now the Visitor and Educational Center for the Wells Reserve, to take this establishing landscape. This is the OM-1 with the 12-45 zoom at 24 millimeters, using program mode and HDR1. I like the subtle way that the OM-1 renders HDR in camera. I have a preset which I developed in Photomatter, which adds just a little bit of pop. Passing through the old overgrown apple orchard at the top of the hill, I had to stop for what I think is a spring azure butterfly and some wildflowers. These are all with the OM-1Mkii and the 100-400 zoom at 800 millimeter equivalent. The close focus on the 100-400 is a major advantage to me, allowing for macro shots like these and allowing you to back off for some shots to include foliage for identification or for artistic reasons without actually moving your position. I don't find that I even have to switch out of my program mode with bird modifications, my custom mode 1, certainly not for butterflies, and not for most wildflowers either. There were a couple of small birds in the brush that deserve some attention. For those, I used the multi-selector button, the joystick, on the OM-1Mkii to switch the focus area from all to my home preset, which is a single point in the center. Even then, I had to use manual focus to get the camera to detect the peewee in its dense cover. The peewee required some added clarity in Photomatter as well to bring out the detail in the partially obscured bird. The road that eventually comes out on Drake's Island, where Laudholm Beach is actually located, has created a small pond behind the dunes and the summer homes along the beach. Again, this is an in-camera HDR using the OM-1 program mode and the 12-45 zoom at 24 millimeters. There's a bit of fog in the air, which you can see more clearly in this shot of the length of the beach running up to the mouth of the little river where the terns and the plovers nest. I kept hoping it would blow over by the time I got there. The beach shot was taken with the same HDR settings as the pond shot, as was this shot of the protected area of the beach. And here's what it's all about. I could see hundreds of least terns in the air over the mouth of the river, but this solitary piping plover was down near the seeping water on the beach. This is the OM-1Mkii and the 100-400 IS zoom at 800 millimeter equivalent. Program mode with my custom bird modifications. I don't like to push too close to the piping plovers. They face enough challenges as it is. So this is a crop with my custom bird preset in Photomatter. I've pared back my post-processing over the past month to add just a bit of dimension and sharpness. A few steps further down the beach and up closer to the protective ropes, I found another piping plover in the dry sand. The fact that these adult plovers are still well away from potential nesting areas means that we won't see chicks until the middle of June, if then. While I'm not sure any least terns were actually on eggs yet, it is clear that pairs are establishing nesting areas, returning to the same small areas of the beach repeatedly. One such area was well outside the protected area of the beach and had been informally staked off. As I walked well around it, I saw some willets in the beach grass at the bend where the little river comes between the dunes of Laudholm and Crescent beaches. Suddenly, two started to interact, and it quickly escalated into a tumbling, bill-snapping, wing-flapping, leg-kicking fight. After watching the first round in awe, I managed to get the control dial of my OM-Mark II into the custom mode 2, my birds in flight and action modifications, to program mode, and the camera up in time to catch round 2. Of course, the birds were right behind the protected area rope, with that yellow rope running right through every shot, often bisecting the birds themselves as they jumped up and tumbled. I shot anyway, hoping I could remove the rope in post-processing where I needed to. The removal tool in Photomator is good and getting better, but it's still not as finely tuned as the standalone Touch Retouch app on my iPad. Touch Retouch has a line tool which intelligently selects lines and line segments and uses some kind of generative fill to remove them. It works well, even when lines cross complex patterns like the body feathers of a bird. I was slightly too far away from the willets, and the combination of heat shimmer and moisture haze, there was still more than a little fog, reduced the clarity of the fight images, but I am still happy with several from the sequence, shooting in SH-1-2 set to 16 frames per second. Neither bird was actually injured in the spat, and one of them flew off after round 2 to sulk at the edge of the river. His flight led my eye to a pair of terns which flew into the far side of the narrow channel between the dunes, one with a sand eel in its bill. A tern offering a fish to its mate is one of the classic wildlife photos that every wildlife photographer wants to get. These two birds were not as close to each other as I would have liked, and again, they were just too far away. I have the 2x digital converter programmed to the record button in my bird custom mode, so I kicked it in to close the distance between myself and the birds, though it does not match the quality of an image taken at 800mm equivalent from half the distance. It does a pretty good job of simulating a 1600mm field of view. By now, 3 Fish and Wildlife workers had hiked up the beach and begun the process of moving the protective ropes to enclose the tern nesting site that was outside the protected area. The terns were not happy about that, even if it was for their own good, and began a coordinated campaign to drive the humans off by flying rapidly and closely around them and by buzzing them like a barnstorming pilot, kamikaze. By association, though I was well back from the nesting area, I came in for the same treatment. So, okay, a great opportunity to practice birds in flight, though there are a few birds that are more difficult to capture in flight than an agitated least tern. Their aerial acrobatics are something to see, and a real challenge to keep in frame long enough for the camera to establish focus. I found that birds had to be pretty far out if I was going to frame them at 800mm, and as they came closer when dive bombing me, I had to pull back to 200mm equivalent to have any chance of keeping them in the frame. Way too often, the camera would not be able to find or lock on to the fast-moving birds against the sky. Before I try this again, I'm going to experiment with setting focus limits for my birds in flight mode to see if that helps. At any rate, I managed to get a few sequences of oncoming or circling birds, and a few shots that I'm more or less happy with. Again, a tern is not an easy bird to photograph even sitting still, as the contrast between stark black and white is a lot for any sensor to handle. I'm increasingly convinced that the OM system engineers tweaked the picture modes on the Mark II to handle highlights better than the original OM-1 did, as most of my shots kept detail in both highlights and shadows, as well as any camera I've ever used. I finished off my beach shots with some photos of the terns resting on the sand near the nest sites, but by then the heat shimmer was getting to the point where photos from any distance show the effects in a subtle loss of detail. Walking out, I took the boardwalk trail through the wet maple swamp, looking, among other things, for jack-in-the-pulpits. I couldn't find any, but I did stop for some cinnamon fern in full fruit, using the OM-1 and with the 12-45 Pro, program mode, and in-camera focus stacking. Soon after, I stood aside for a group of 6 tourists to pass me, and they stopped 20 yards on and stood looking up into the trees. I could hear something singing softly and eventually spotted an eastern towhee, sitting on the exposed branch not 10 feet above their heads. Very strange behavior for a towhee, which are generally super skulkers, staying hidden in the foliage or the undergrowth. And it was singing an atypical alternative song as well. More towhee, towhee, than drink your tea, tea, tea. Who knows? After they moved on, it still sat there for me as I walked up under it and photographed it from several different angles, trying for different backgrounds and playing with exposure compensation on the OM-Mark II with the 100 to 400 IS zoom. It was still there when I decided I had enough photos and walked on. Back to the car and home to an interesting afternoon processing photos. So that's OM Systems, versatile by design.